Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really intriguing question, one that kind of challenges our modern-day confidence. What if you could go back to 1787 France, right before the Revolution, armed with all your current knowledge, history, economics, psychology, everything, and you step into Louis XVI's shoes? Could you actually do better? Could you have maybe steered things differently, avoided the whole revolution?
It's a brilliant what if, really, and the sources we're looking at today, they don't just treat it as a hypothetical pub chat. No, they use this exact scenario, surprisingly effectively, I think, to explore something much bigger. How good are we humans, any of us, even with modern knowledge, at actually managing truly complex systems? And it draws on psychological experiments, computer simulations, all sorts of things.
Right. So that's our mission for this deep dive. Unpack these sources, the history, the experiments, the game simulations, figure out why managing complexity is just so darn difficult and what that might tell us about, well, our own limits.
Okay, so let's set the scene. France, 1787. The material paints a picture of a nation just teetering on the edge, especially financially. Louis XVI was facing a monumental crisis.
Yeah, and the sources list some key culprits. You had the Queen, Marie Antoinette, and her spinning that whole Madame Deficit thing. Very visible.
Very visible, exactly. She was an easy target, a symbol. But, the documents are clear. While her spending wasn't insignificant, it wasn't the root cause, not by a long shot. The real issue was this massive national debt. We're talking 2 billion francs, which is just staggering for the time.
And a huge chunk of that came from funding the American Revolution,
Right.
helping the Americans stick it to the British.
That's right. A geopolitical win, maybe, but financially crippling for France. And then you layer on top of that this incredibly unfair social structure. The clergy, the nobility, they held most of the wealth, but paid hardly any taxes. So the burden fell on, well, everyone else.
Okay, so enter the what if. Could a modern person fix this? The sources mention this fascinating 1986 simulation by Cooley and Badka, German psychologists. They literally gave participants the 1787 lowdown Louis XVI's problems and said, okay, you're in charge, make a plan.
And you see people coming up with ideas that sound, well, pretty sensible to us now.
Like what? Taxing the rich.
Yeah, exactly. Tax the nobles heavily, or let's boost exports, get some foreign currency flowing in, and definitely cut the royal spending Marie Antoinette needs to tighten her belt, things like that.
Makes sense on the surface. So how did they do?
Well, this is the kicker. The experiment found that despite having, 200 years of hindsight and modern economic ideas, their plans mostly failed. They just didn't really address the core problems effectively. Either they focused on the wrong things, like the Queen's spending, which was peanuts compared to the debt, or the tax system, or their solutions, like just saying tax the nobles. Well, they had no practical way to actually do that given the political realities laid out.
So knowing the answer wasn't enough, they couldn't figure out how to implement it in that specific messy context.
Precisely. It's a real reality check. Compare that to what actually happened. Louis' finance minister, Cologne, he actually had a plan that sounds, frankly, quite modern. Tax reform, hitting everyone, abolishing internal tariffs, even taking some church land, setting up local assemblies, trying to ease tensions.
But it didn't work, historically.
Nope. Completely blocked by the nobles who refused to give up their privileges. Cologne got sacked in 1787. 2 years later. Revolution. 6 years after that. Louis loses his head. So the real history shows just how locked in that system was. It wasn't just bad luck, it was deeply resistant to the very changes needed.
Okay, so the Louis XVI experiment really casts doubt on this idea that modern knowledge is some kind of superpower in past situations. It makes you ask, why is it still so hard even when you're just simulating it?
Exactly. And that leads us perfectly into the next bit of research highlighted in the sources, the work of Dietrich Dörner, a German cognitive scientist. His book, The Logic of Failure, uses computer simulations in a really insightful way.
Ah, yes, the games. Like managing a city in Britain or leading a nomadic tribe in West Africa.
Those are the ones. And there are business simulations, too, like one called 4AD used in U.S. universities where students played CEO.
So what was the task in these?
Fundamentally, you're the planner.
Yeah.
You get information, you analyze problems, you devise strategies, you implement them. And crucially, the computer simulates the outcome over time. You see how your decisions play out in the society or the company.
And the source mentioned a big plus. You see failure much faster than in real life.
Yeah.
No waiting 20 years for your policy to flop.
Right. Quick feedback.
Right.
But here's the really, really striking finding from Dörner's work and similar studies. Most people did badly. Really badly. Regardless of their background, students, managers, whoever, when faced with managing these complex human or natural systems, their simulated worlds often collapse.
Collapsed how?
Oh, populations booming, then crashing, economies grinding to a halt, environments getting wrecked, people starving. Pretty dramatic failures.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
sobering. If even smart people in simulations fail consistently, what makes these systems so inherently difficult? What's the core problem?
The research boils it down to three key characteristics. First, opacity. You just can't see everything that's going on inside. The source uses this analogy. It's like throwing a stone into a system, but you don't hear a clear plunk right away. You get maybe a delayed muffled echo, you're feeling around in the dark.
Like poking at a black box from the outside.
Exactly like a black box. Second, interconnectedness. Everything affects everything else. It's not linear. It's this incredibly complex web of feedback loops, positive and negative. The source calls it super tangled.
Pull one string over here and something totally unexpected happens way over there.
Precisely. And third, dynamic nature. These systems aren't just sitting still waiting for you to act. They're constantly changing on their own. So you have to predict not just how the system is now, but how it's evolving and how your actions will interact with that evolution. It's juggling multiple moving parts, many of which you can't even see properly.
Right. Opacity, interconnectedness, and dynamism.
Yeah.
That sounds like a recipe for difficulty. And the sources say that even with the simulation giving them maybe more information than a real leader gets, people still made predictable mistakes.
Yeah, common errors kept cropping up. One big one, tied to that opacity and dynamism, is our human bias towards assuming immediate cause and effect, like flicking a light switch.
We expect things to happen now.
Exactly. But complex systems, they have delays, sometimes long delays. Economists talk about policy lag, but it happens everywhere. Your action today might not show results for months or years. There's this brilliant little experiment mentioned by Ute Reicher in 1988 that shows this perfectly.
Oh, the refrigerator one. Yeah, tell us about that. The task seems simple enough. Get a cold room down from 15 degrees Celsius to exactly 4 degrees using a dial.
Simple sounding, yes. But the dial went from 0 to 200, and crucially, the subjects didn't know the exact relationship between the dial number and the final temperature. That was part one of the complexity. Part two, and this is key, there was a 5-minute delay. You turn the dial and nothing happens for 5 minutes. Then the temperature starts to move towards the new target.
And it wasn't smooth sailing even then, right?
Yeah.
They could overshoot.
Exactly. It might overshoot, then undershoot, oscillating around the target level before finally settling. So there's delay and oscillation.
Okay, so what was the right way to do it, according to the research?
It was actually pretty straightforward, but totally counterintuitive to our itchy trigger fingers. You set the dial to any value.
Yeah.
Then you wait.
Just wait.
Just wait. Let the 5 minutes pass, let the temperature swing back and forth, let it stabilize. Once it's stable, you see what temperature that setting produced. Now you know one data point. You can calculate the relationship. Turns out a setting of 23 gave 4 degrees, and then you set it correctly and leave it.
But people didn't do that.
Almost nobody did. Because of the delay, they assumed the system wasn't working or they'd set it wrong. As soon as the temperature wasn't 4 degrees right now, they'd tweak the dial again and again. And again.
Before this system even had a chance to respond to the last tweak.
Precisely. They were constantly intervening based on incomplete feedback, chasing their own tails. The graphs apparently show the temperature just swinging wildly, never stabilizing because they never let the system settle. The source even mentions participants getting so frustrated they just started spinning the dial randomly near the end. Total loss of control.
This was a relatively simple system. 5-minute delay, clear data. Imagine trying to manage an economy with lags measured in years and data that's noisy and incomplete.
Exactly. It highlights that fundamental human difficulty with delayed feedback. And that leads to another common error, this one related more to the interconnectedness.
Which is?
The difficulty finding the right leverage point. Because everything's connected, it's hard to know where to focus your effort. People tend to either jump frantically between different goals, trying to fix everything at once, or they latch onto the wrong target altogether.
Let's go back to that Greenville City simulation by Derner. The mayor trying to make citizens happier by juggling jobs, housing, welfare.
Right. And the source gives that example. Okay, you want to build more houses, great. But that costs money, so you raise taxes. Maybe people leave, businesses suffer, tax revenue falls. Suddenly you have less money for housing. It's all tangled.
So what did the simulated mayors do wrong?
Well, the big finding was that most failed to improve overall satisfaction. And a very common mistake was focusing on the wrong problems.
Like the mayor standing outside the supermarket.
Yeah, that's a great example from the source. Literally asking random shoppers what bugged them and then spending ages on relatively minor visible issues like making sure pensioners could easily reach a phone booth, measuring walking speeds.
Well, maybe the economy was tanking or housing was collapsing.
Exactly. Acting like, as the source puts it, firefighting captains rushing to the nearest smoke. Or those officials in novels who focus on the obvious stuff instead of the critical underlying priority issues.
Sounds like focusing on what's easy to see, or maybe easy to fix.
That too. There's another example of a mayor who actually had public service experience. Faced with all the city's problems, they focused almost entirely on schools
Why schools?
because it was familiar territory. They knew how to deal with school problems. So they tackled the problems they knew how to solve, not necessarily the problems the city needed them to solve most urgently.
That feels depressingly familiar. You can see how that might play out in real life, right? Governments or managers addressing the things they understand or the things that are getting headlines rather than the really messy, deep-seated structural problems.
Although the source does add a small caveat sometimes. For leaders facing paralysis, tackling any problem, even a suboptimal one, might be better than doing nothing at all. But generally, yeah, misidentifying the target is a huge issue.
So taking all this together, the simulation failures, these common errors, like ignoring delays, focusing on the wrong targets, what's the underlying cause?
The research really points towards fundamental limitations in our human cognitive ability, how our brains are wired. When we face these really complex, opaque, interconnected, dynamic systems, these black boxes, we struggle.
The source mentioned something about us having like prehistoric brains trying to deal with industrial or information age complexity.
Yeah, that's the idea. Our core processing power for this kind of systemic thinking might not have evolved as much as the complexity of the world around us has. We're good at immediate local problems, maybe less so at these vast, slow-moving, tangled ones.
And the outlook for improvement isn't great based on the material. No hidden brain power we can just unlock.
The perspective presented is, well, pretty pessimistic on that front. It uses this analogy. It's like an animal trying to run faster on three legs while dragging a perfectly good fourth one behind it. The suggestion is we're probably already using most of the relevant cognitive tools we have for these problems. We're running as fast as our design allows on this track.
Okay, so let's bring it all back. We started with Louis XVI in 1787. If a modern person, knowing all this, went back,
Yeah.
what happens?
Based on all these findings, the Louis XVI simulation, the Durner games, the refrigerator experiment, the common errors, the conclusion drawn by the sources is pretty unavoidable. Failure. Failure is the most likely outcome.
Just straight up failure.
Yeah. And the material even suggests the modern person falling into these typical traps of over-intervention or misguided focus might actually make things worse. They could potentially accelerate their own trip to the guillotine and maybe cause even more suffering along the way.
Wow. So much for riding in on a white horse of modern knowledge. That's
Yeah,
quite a conclusion.
it is.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive, complex systems, opaque, interconnected, dynamic, are incredibly hard to manage. Humans, even modern ones, make predictable errors. We ignore delays. We focus on the wrong things. Our basic cognitive wiring just might not be optimized for this level of complexity.
It really challenges that easy assumption that more knowledge automatically equals better management in these situations.
Yeah.
And I think the real value here isn't just dunking on our modern egos or debating history. It's understanding why these systems are hard and what those common pitfalls are, recognizing them in ourselves, whether you're, leading a country, managing a project, or just trying to figure out a complex problem in your own life. That awareness is maybe the first step.
That's a great point. So here's something to chew on. If simulations show that even with some advantages, most people struggle profoundly with complexity, what does that imply about the real-world leaders navigating today's crises without a reset button or perfect information? And maybe more personally, how might knowing about these common cognitive traps change how you approach the next complex challenge you face?